crosses that double arrow. The electoral votes that are necessary for victory have been achieved, and as you can see, Biden's pretty much there already. We have 8 swing states now, which means that for Trump to win, he must win all of them. And for Biden to win, he only needs to pick up 1. More to the point for this specific audience, look at Texas. Deep red Texas is now a swing state. What's going on here is the American political parties are going through their once every generation or two breakdown. That means that the rules that we think of as normal for American politics are, for now, in abeyance. The current Republican Party no longer includes military voters, fiscal voters, or business voters. So if Trump does win Texas, it will be cut because of a relatively new consolidated voting bloc, Mexicans. As a rule, Mexicans are social conservatives, and they are now part of Trump's core coalition. So will Trump lose the election in a couple weeks? Probably. Will Texas flip? It might. But the real point is that what we think of as the normal rules and coalitions and what makes up the parties in the United States, they're changing. Everything is in flux at the moment. And once reliable assumptions like Texans vote Republican no longer hold true. Which means that until the two parties figure themselves out, and then we have another presidential election, everything's in flux, and the United States cannot have a functional foreign policy. So at least 4 more years of this, probably 8. But enough with American politics, let's talk about your politics. Now, AMLO remains popular. His ratings did drop over the summer, but he's still above 50%. The primary reason for the drop is that Mexicans' 2 leading concerns are security and health, and those are categories that AMLO has utterly ignored. Consequently, the cartel wars have reached a critical point, and that requires us taking a couple of steps back. First, a bit of backstory. So back in 2015, there were 3 broad coalitions in the Mexican cartel landscape: the Sinaloa, the Gulf, and the Terra Caliente, The Peña administration at the time had de facto allied itself with the most powerful faction, the Sinaloa, in order to weaken the others. Part of that de facto alliance involved a lot of bribes and no small amount of outright collusion, which is why General Cienfuegos was arrested 2 weeks ago. But the Peña administration strategy broadly worked, which ended up gutting the leadership of the Gulf cartel there in green. In their place rose the Zetas, who used to be the Gulf cartel's enforcement wing. And when they took over, they weren't exactly great managers, so the entire area kind of crumbled. The Peña strategy of partnering with Sinaloa continued, now targeting the Zetas instead, and the Zetas largely collapsed as a functional organization, and the former Gulf territory became dissolved into internecine street warfare. Of course, that's not the whole story. That was just the eastern part of Mexico. Further west, you had the Sinaloa, and as part of what was going on north of the border, Sinaloa ultimately fell because El Chapo was captured, and his organization too fell into chaos. Now, further west, the pretender to the throne became El Mencho of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, that's the blue, who set about the bloody work of taking over his former boss's turf. Which brings us to today. Today, Jalisco New Generation is expanding. The central government's war on the cartels has ended under AMLO. And we are seeing Jalisco New Generation spreading throughout the border zones, most notably in Chihuahua and Baja. Which means that we are on the verge of Jalisco New Generation bringing the war directly to the plazas and starting to establish footholds in the United States. Now, we're not to the point yet where the cartel wars are directly endangering trade, but that is coming. Jalisco New Generation's expansion will bring the cartel violence to and through America's doorstep. And if New Generation succeeds in dominating the plazas, Jalisco New Generation will displace Sinaloa as the United States' and as the world's largest organized crime group. And that will have negative implications for American-Mexican relations in general and US-Mexican trade in specific. In this time of political fratricide in the United States, one of the few things that can unite us is fear. And if Jalisco New Generation provides that fear, the Mexican state is going to face some very intense pressure from Washington. This is the biggest concern I have about Mexico specifically and US-Mexican relations in general. But as I'm sure you've noticed, it's hardly all bad news in the bilateral relationship. Much to my surprise, having a pair of narcissistic megalomaniacs running our respective countries has not led to conflict. Under the leadership of these two gentlemen, we've not only maintained but expanded the world's greatest trade and energy relationships. We've meaningfully addressed, if not solved, the immigration issue, which is something that's vexed both sides for our entire histories. Bilateral relations today are the best they have ever been. I did not see this coming. And there's some other solidly good news I'd like you to keep in mind. What we've got here is a map of the countries at 1989 who were either in the process of transitioning to democracies or were just starting. The blues were the legacy democratic countries. The reds were those that didn't try, and the orange is what matters. Those are the countries that decided to give this democracy, free market thing a shot. Mexico is obviously part of that list. But if you fast forward to just a couple years ago, you'll see that not a lot made it. Democracy doesn't just happen. It's a struggle. It's a constant struggle. Now, Latin America didn't really begin to democratize until about 1990. And it is only now collectively dealing with the second phase of this process where it kind of fine-tunes its institutions. The first constitution, the first process, the first currency, however you want to look at it, that's just to get the ball rolling. That's the start of the transition program. Now the hard stuff kicks in. So, for example, Colombia is dealing with the success of resolving its civil war. It probably needs a new constitution. Mexico and Brazil clearly need new constitutions, and Chile has decided to try making one. Now, I don't want to sugarcoat this. There are dangers here. When France was at this stage back in the 1960s, it caught on fire. When the Germans and the Russians tried it after World War I, they clearly got it wrong. America had a civil war. But what's going on in Mexico today, what's going on across Latin America today, is part of a necessary debate. And Latin America is hardly alone. South Africa, Spain, Portugal, Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, they all need to go through this process right now. It's awkward, it's loud, it's messy. It's part of being a democratic system. And I actually have higher confidence that Latin America in general, and Mexico in specific, will manage this process better than the rest of the world. Latin America is sufficiently socially dynamic, and their democratic constitutions new enough that saying we need a new constitution isn't taboo. It's part of the conversation. This is a good problem. And to this point, I'd argue that the region is handling it fairly well. Just don't let a single person dominate the process. AMLO may be off his peak, but his approval rating remains comfortably above 50%, which makes him one of the top 2 most popular politicians in the G20. He will attempt to use that popularity to entrench his ideology upon the Mexican system, starting with the 2021 midterms. Do not let him do that to your constitution. But he has to be part of the conversation. Okay, that's the bad news. Let's talk about everything else. Now, for those of you who've seen me before, you recognize this chart. This is the Mexican demography. It's a consumption-led system. Whenever you've got a population structure below the bottom half of this graphic, 45 and under, it's all about the spending on kids and cars and college and so on. In a consumption-led system, it's the people who provide the economic activity and the people who provide the economic growth, and Mexico is squarely in the comfort zone as far as that is concerned. In addition, the United States really likes what they see when they look at Mexico. Consumption-led means that Mexicans buy a lot of American exports, And people who have only been in their jobs for a decade or two means that they're relatively low on the value-added scale compared to Americans. So the propensity to trade between a higher tech American system and a higher manufacturing-based Mexican system is huge. Mexico and America are now each other's largest trading partners. That is something that will not end in our lives. This is what a partner looks like, and this is not. Korea had a baby bust 50 years ago. They never recovered. They have a lot of workers in their late 40s to early 60s, people who have been on the job for 3, even 4 decades. Very high value added, but because there are very few 20 and 30 somethings, the Koreans cannot possibly consume everything that they produce. So South Korea is the quintessential export-led economy, and the Americans notice it, because Korean goods are hyper competitive. They overproduce for their economy and then they dump it on the international system. And they're going head to head with the American workforce. We do not appreciate that. Now, between 1980 and 2015, the world was kind of in this wondrous demographic moment. All of the world's economies were either consumption-led or export-led, and they were in more or less balance. Here's a number of the major systems back in 2000. China at this time was particularly favorable. The one-child policy had gutted the birth rate, freeing up cash that was normally spent on children to be spent on other sorts of consumption that generated more economic growth, also to be spent on investment. But this was never more than a moment in time. And 20 years later, we are all 20 years older. Back in 2015, the global demographic of high consumption was already ending. And again, look at China. It has no replacement generation. So even if everyone the world over bows to Chinese wishes, historically speaking, the panda boom has been nothing more than a flash in the pan. As to the export-led economies, they are aging into mass retirement, where they're neither consumers nor exporters. On balance, the year 2022 is the year that most of the advanced world shifts into kind of a post-growth model, where they're neither consumption-driven nor export-driven. The United States among the advanced world is the exception. Now, the American baby boomer population, that's the green, as a percent of the American population, may be the largest generation in our history, but they were also the smallest of their cohort when compared to all other advanced countries. So are we pushing a big generation into that post-growth system? Sure, but it's smaller compared to everybody else. The real boon for the United States, though, are the millennials. They are our second largest generation ever, but similar millennial cadres only exist in 2 other advanced economies, France and New Zealand. That's it. So the millennials are the single largest chunk of consumption activity in the world, and the United States really is the only player in the game when it comes to being able to use that to absorb imports. Let me give you an idea of how big the shift is that's coming and how fast it's going to be here. It's all about scale. This is the world's top 30 consumption-led economies stacked up by GDP today. And here's what it's going to look like in 2030, which means that global consumption has already peaked. It's only going to fall back from here. Here's the world's export-led systems, both in 2020 and 10 years from now. Well, what that tells me is that not only is global consumption already at the peak, global capital supplies are. Most of the money that is generated for investment comes from people preparing for retirement. Well, once you move into retirement, you're not generating any new capital. So the export-led systems have been exporting capital that has fueled investment the world over now for 20 years. That ends this decade. And this was before COVID. Here's the really scary part. Here's the post-growth system. Right now, Japan's the only one. They're the only one that's aged to that point. But again, 10 years from now, it's a whole different world. Now, shifting from consumption-led to export-led is difficult. The only reason we didn't notice too much of it this past 60 years is America was maintaining the global order, and it made it a relatively smooth process. We kept the global system running. We allowed markets to be open. We used our own to indirectly subsidize all the would-be exporting economies. And whether you were in Europe or East Asia, that eased the social and cultural transition. But shifting from an export-led system to a post-growth system, where you really don't have economic growth, that requires a complete security, political, economic, financial, social, and cultural overhaul. To this point, only Japan has pulled it off. And Japan did it over 30 years with American security coverage from a very rich starting point. And the Japanese economy today is the same size that it was 30 years ago. It hasn't grown. For everyone else, they were going to have to do it in the first half of this decade. And then COVID comes in and robs them of prep time. All the money that might have been spent on preparing their systems for what happens when you can never have economic growth again, that money's being burned on the virus, which means that we will never return to the economic conditions globally of 2019. And of course, COVID is not done surprising us. What we have here is my preferred method of looking at coronavirus. It's the 7-day moving average for new positive coronavirus cases in the United States, state by state, and it's in per capita terms, so these numbers are comparable. The threshold to pay attention to is right here when you have 50 new cases per, 50 cases per day per million. That's considered the endemic level. If the virus is spreading at that number, it's pretty much impossible to get the virus out of the population without a multi-month, relatively strict lockdown in the way that the Melbourners did down in Australia. It took them 3 months to crush it down below that level. Now, America's national inability, and when I say national, I mean at the federal level, the state level, and the local level, we have failed in every possible way. Our inability to manage the epidemic means that the virus is now endemic throughout the entire country. And our epidemic north of the border will not end until such time as we have an effective, widely distributed vaccine. Economically, this means that the COVID recession is no longer a one-off, but instead a deep impacting event affecting every economic sector. It has become a normal recession and still has a long way to go. This means that the shifts in consumption patterns that we've been suffering through, they've got legs. Retail, entertainment, travel, tourism, those are the obvious ones, but even within agriculture, there are big shifts. People are going out less, which means that the things that they would eat at restaurants like bacon and cheese and steaks, demand has collapsed, whereas things that they eat at home like ground beef have skyrocketed. Every sector is experiencing similar distortions. Don't get me started on commercial real estate. It's already down by almost a third. Which leaves the question, how soon can we have an effective, widely distributed vaccine? What we're after is artificial herd immunity, and that requires at least 60% of the population being resistant to the virus. Now in New York City, the most infected city with the highest rates, they're only looking at about 20%. So we need another, basically half of the population nationwide to get vaccinated. That's easier said than done. We need a functional formula. Some good news on that front. We'll probably know what that is within 1 to 6 weeks. Second, we need a mass manufacturing system. Third, a mass distribution system. And only then can we start mass inoculation, which means this all really matters what the winning formula is. Assuming an easy manufacturing and distribution system and a single shot formula, the best case scenario for the United States having herd immunity would be June. But today, the leading candidate in the vaccine race is a 2-shot formula that requires storage at negative 94 degrees Fahrenheit. You can't just commandeer a food truck for that. Now, if this version proves to be the winning formula, we're not going to be able to get that into mass circulation in 2021 at all. And then you're talking about 2023 for the recovery. The bottom line is you shouldn't count on normal demand and pricing patterns and an end to recessionary activity until at least 2022. That's just the environment we're in. And a change of administration will not alter this time frame. Remember, we're no longer in a one-off economic shock event. Even if the new Congress passes a new COVID mitigation and recovery program on day one, that policy will not generate meaningful economic outcomes until at least May or June anyway. Add in a few months for such measures to take effect, and we're already pushing the end of the year. And you have to count on a 6 to 9 month lag before any benefits north of the border really start to trickle down in terms of vaccine distribution south of the border. And the US isn't alone. Of the top 15 consumption-led economies in the world, only Australia is not under some degree of coronavirus lockdown. And again, that 50, that's where things get bad. And Mexico, India, and Brazil, I think we all know that the data is showing a lower level of infections than reality, which means that we're all in this together. And when I say us, I mean the consumption-led economies. We are all offline, and we are all desperately bringing our production needs in-house for reasons of health, reasons of national security, and populist reasons. Which means if you're an export-led economy, you've got no one to sell to. Folks, this is it. It's over. Most countries will never return to where they were in 2019. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, I thought he said he was done with the bad news. Well, in the short term, this is obviously not great, but I urge you to take a longer view. The world's export-led economies will not recover. Mexico's a consumption-based one, which means that when COVID finally is over, Mexico will have the American economy all to itself. Now, say what you will about the Trump administration, and there's so much, so very much that we could say about the Trump administration. One of the things it got right was prioritizing trade rearrangements for the post-Cold War world. There are only 5 deals that the Trump administration has pursued: Canada, Mexico, Japan, Korea, and the United Kingdom. All countries that really don't have a choice in the matter. South Korea doesn't exist without American security overwatch. Canada does not even have the option of pivoting. The United Kingdom destroyed its link to the European Union, so it's a deal on America's terms or nothing. And it is seared into Japan's collective memory just what happens should the Americans turn hostile. Of the 5, only Mexico has anything that the United States actually wants: a young demographic, a growing market, and a complementary economic system. And with the exception of the UK, a deal with which will either happen later this year or early next year, these deals are done. They're signed, they're ratified, they're implemented. And this is half of the American trade portfolio. So once the United States is done with coronavirus, it's not so much that we get back to business as usual up north, but we start a fundamentally new era in American economic relations, where we only have a very limited number of countries that we allow to have access. And Mexico is the only one on that list that we actually want to have that access. In terms of trade in the elections, it's a contest right now between Biden and Trump over who can be more anti-Chinese. And this isn't just election talk. This is the United States entering a sharply anti-Chinese phase and a sharply anti-trade phase that's going to run for at least a decade or two, at the same time that the Chinese are experiencing system-breaking challenges, although that's a topic for another day. Also, despite China's recovery from coronavirus in terms of getting virus counts down, its economy is reeling. Between lower global oil demand and American retooling, export orders have dried up. What growth the Chinese are experiencing is mostly from inventory builds. And the last time we saw inventory builds like this in East Asia, it was the 1998 Asian financial crisis. That set the stage for almost a half decade of economic collapse. Also, there will be no meaningful negotiations between the Americans and the Chinese on trade, regardless of who wins. If it's Trump, he's lost Terry Branstad, who's the guy in the lower left. He's a former American governor of Iowa, the longest serving American governor in history. He knew Xi personally since 1985. They were friends. And when it became apparent to him that the Chinese weren't even listening to the things he was saying, he resigned. His last day was a couple of weeks ago. As for Biden, Biden has made it very clear that he's going to pursue a policy of economic nationalism, which is going to largely lock out the East Asians and the Western Europeans from the American market. So it's just a question now of what flavor of trade hostility the United States has with the rest of the world. But whether it is Biden purposefully hammering things down or Trump rolling grenades, the theme is more or less the same. The era of the United States participating in a broader global economy are over. And without the United States holding up the global ceiling, it is very difficult to see global trade happening at all. I want to talk about a couple of sectors that impact Mexico directly, and then talk about some of the things going on in Mexico specifically. First, for those of you who have seen me before, you recognize this. This is my energy price volume chart. The broader the bar, the greater the volume of crude oil being produced and exported. The taller the bar, the greater the cost of producing it. Now, this is 2012 data, so almost a decade ago. Back then, US shale was the most expensive and it wasn't all that big. OPEC was obviously cheap and was there in huge volume. But a decade later, here's where we are as of January. US shale is not simply below the global cost average, it's below the OPEC average. And in fact, things since January have gotten kind of weird and even better by some measures. Right now, the United States is about 1 million barrels per day off of where we were for peak production as of the end of last year. We have had significant consolidation in the industry on this side of the border, which means that the new players are much more efficient. So our break-even price has probably dropped to below $35 a barrel. Second, a lot of the larger players who have the more financial wherewithal and who are not desperate, who have to just pump to get any cash they can, they have decided to drill and to frack, but then to cap the wells. They have probably done that on enough wells at this point, 7 months into this process, that represents about 1 million barrels per day of potentially fresh output. And completing that frac log would probably only cost about $25 a barrel. So for at least the next year, you are looking at production costs in the United States already being lower than they are in Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And it is very unlikely that that combined with technological advances, which are still coming through, it's very likely the United States is ever going to give that up. So the United States is now the low-cost producer in the world. And anytime there's a bump in prices, another flood of oil comes out of Texas. In terms of manufacturing, we've also seen some pretty dramatic changes. What we've got here is value-added manufacturing for components that flow into the United States. The 1555 in the middle is total value-added manufacturing in America. All the other numbers are the value-added components coming in, with the number in the circle indicating the value in billions of US dollars, and the color indicating the reliability of those parts in the era that I see unfolding. Anything in green is fine. Anything in yellow, figure 25% of the components aren't going to make it on any given day. In orange, figure half won't make it. And anything in red, you should just write off. It's done. You'll notice the US has a lot of green, a lot of yellow, and no red. This doesn't mean that American manufacturing is immune to what's coming, but it does mean that we can probably grow through it, particularly with some assistance from Mexico. This is something we can deal with. For the Germans, it's not nearly as positive. Two things. Number one, the Germans are far more dependent upon components, even from countries beyond the horizon, than the Americans are. But perhaps just as important, because of the demographic collapse in Europe, the Germans are also dependent on exports to countries beyond the horizon. So whereas the Americans can kind of grow through this with our partners down in Mexico, the Germans can't. Their entire economic model has to change. But as bad as it is in Germany, it's far worse in China. Despite rhetoric to the contrary, the Chinese are really not making a lot of progress technologically. I'm sure you've all heard of the Made in China 2025 program, the idea that in just 5 years, the Chinese are going to be at a technological peer level with the Western countries. No. If you can talk to a Chinese bureaucrat behind closed doors where their boss can't hear them, they will readily admit that the real date is probably more like 2070. 2025 is just kind of the first post in the road. They don't have that kind of time, which means that the United States, because of the shale revolution, is positioned well for the low end side of manufacturing. But because of its capital and technological structure, it's positioned well for the high end. And then Mexico does the stuff in the middle. This is a system that works. This is a system that doesn't require a lot of organization from the top. Good thing too, because we're not very good at it on either side of the border. There are 6 subsectors within the manufacturing space that I think you should pay particular attention to, because they're the ones that are relocating most quickly. First up, no shocker, automotive. Now, in the world of automotive, everybody builds a little bit of everything. But between coronavirus and the trade war, we've seen disruptions to all of these systems, and now the shale revolution has lowered costs. So Texas and Mexico already own this space. And the real question in this industry is whether or not Texas and Mexico can build up capacity fast enough without triggering labor pressures. Ironically, coronavirus might have helped with that, because there's a lot of people who are unemployed right now who can take those jobs. Next up, and probably the industry to have the biggest splash as it relocates, is heavy machinery. In many ways, it's similar to automotive, but it's a lot more concentrated, because while everybody wants a car, not everybody needs a forklift. So whether it's farm equipment, mining equipment, or heavy machinery for construction, this whole industry is now in motion, in part because of NAFTA 2. One of the clauses of NAFTA 2 forces an 80% relocation. 80% of the parts that go into the final product sold in North America have to be made in North America, which means that this wholesale relocation of heavy machinery from North America, and the United States specifically, to China is now in screaming reverse. The question is, where should it go? Mexico will probably end up owning this space with a little help from places like Houston. There are also some synergies with automotive, so I'm sure there'll be some parts of it that go back and forth, just like with automotive. But in terms of cost structure, this is something that Mexico is very likely to pick up almost in its entirety. Third, textiles. The technology of automation has now advanced to the point that it is actually cheaper to produce yarn and cloth in the United States using automation than it is to use semi-skilled labor in Bangladesh. I don't think Mexico is going to get much of this, because the US can just have machines do it. However, the part of the textile process that is not cheaper in the United States is the finishing work. That still requires human hands and human eyes. If anything, this might be too low skill for Mexico, but there's the option of having piggybacking in either southern Mexico or Central America, maybe Colombia. Fourth, electronics. Like automotive, everyone produces a little bit of everything, and there's nothing secretive about this. It's popping up all over the northern Mexican states. Baja's doing medical, and Nuevo León is doing televisions, but all parts of it need partners north of the border, and I look forward to having an automotive-style exchange of various production stages going back and forth. This is the new big growth sector for bilateral trade. Fifth is wiring. Because the shale revolution has pushed production costs through the floor and has drastically lowered the cost of electricity in the United States, we're going to be seeing a lot of metal smelting coming back to the United States that has been gone for 30, 40 years, because it really just comes down to who has the most reliable, cheap power. And in that, the United States has a very strong advantage over Mexico. But the more metal the Americans forge and the more wire they pull, the more wiring harnesses, the value added stuff that goes into everything that has an electrical current, the more of that's going to be in Mexico. So this is, again, like electronics, like automotive, even like heavy machinery, one of those new sectors that we're going to see lots of bilateral flows. And then finally, we've got semiconductors. And semiconductors gets really messy. It's a big business. It's a complicated business. The melting of the silicon oxide, the pulling it into crystals, the slicing into wafers, the doping and baking of those wafers, and then cutting them and fabricating them in chips. All that's done in the same facility. I mean, a cheap one of those costs $4 billion US. And relocating those is something that companies do not do lightly or quickly. They're if they're just too expensive to justify hopscotching them around. But in the world that we're moving to, it's something that has to happen. It'll probably happen at the last second, because Silicon Valley has resisted any sort of relocation of their facilities from the East Asian Rim to anywhere. For them, it's an issue of sunk costs. And so they will hold out and hold out until eventually either circumstances or politics force them. Now, there are some parts of the computing chain that can be relocated now. Making of motherboards, flash drives, final computer assembly, putting together things that are made from those microchips. That's all currently done in Thailand and China, and that is already looking for locations more appropriate for the world that we're entering. For the steps that cannot be automated, where you need hands and eyes, Mexico's a solid candidate for all of it. And for the steps that can be automated, the United States looks pretty good. And having those two countries in close proximity with a solid trade relationship and them both being consumption-led, this adds up to be another beautiful chapter in the American-Mexican relationship. But looking forward, every single stage of the manufacturing process for semiconductors, except the manufacture of those chips itself, is something that Mexico is already competitive in. It's just a question of building out the industrial plant. All right, I'm going to close with a couple slides to give you an idea of what's going on north of the border that actually is going to work out very, very well for you. Now, these color zones show the metro mega regions that have the options of combining efforts in manufacturing to achieve economies of scale. So I want to take a quick walk around the United States so that you can see the parts that you'll either will be partnering with or might be competition. Let's start out west with California. California is lit up in two different zones because California's a mess. After 70 years, they still haven't been able to link northern and southern California to achieve economies of scale with a rail line. I mean, this is not the hard part. And then the LA Basin's infrastructure policy is so wretched that traffic is so bad that LA cannot even achieve economies of scale within Los Angeles. Now, that doesn't mean that in-migration or economic development is impossible, but it does mean that you can't have a Texas-Mexico style synergy and you can't have a hub and spoke model in terms of manufacturing. And that's before you consider regulatory and tax headwinds. And that's before you consider that Silicon Valley is about to get hosed. The bottom line is that California cannot substitute for East Asia in high-tech manufacturing, or at least not in anything less than a decade timescale, which means that the volume of product that Mexico is going to ship to California is about to explode because they can't do it themselves. On the other side of the country, in the Piedmont Atlantic, kind of the interior south, this is your biggest competition. The Southerners, how to put this? The Americans of the South are in many ways the gringo equivalent of Mexicans. They know how to schmooze. They are very good at working with people. They know how to go to another country and wine and dine would-be investors. They are far too far away to integrate with Mexico. And they prefer to train up locals to do the work. And they're very, very good at it. So they will go not to a company in another state, but to a company in another country that is having problems and figure out how you can get them to move to Atlanta or Charleston or something. And every bit of business that they get is one that you won't, and one that you probably won't be able to participate in. Texas Triangle: Houston, San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth. These are your buddies. The Texas Triangle is the perfect mix of land and labor and capital and low regulation with a Mexico kicker, and it has been the fastest growing region economically in the United States for 20 straight years for good reason. And assuming nothing changes policy-wise, which I don't think it will, this policy set has at least another couple of decades to go, probably a lot more. The only caveat I have about the Texas Triangle is that they've been so successful for so long that before COVID, they were starting to have labor shortages, forcing them to integrate with some cities in Oklahoma on purpose. And for those of you who know Texans, it's like, they'd much rather deal with Mexico than deal with Oklahoma. Gulf Coast. This is kind of a subsidiary to your relationship with the Texas Triangle. mostly energy and petrochemicals. And of course, Houston has a foot in both worlds. It's where energy meets manufacturing. So economically, I expect the Houston metro to be the fastest growing one in the country for at least the next generation. Changing gears a little, I do want to kind of point out a region of the United States you probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about. And that's the Front Range, the Denver area down to Albuquerque, and the Arizona Sun Corridor, obviously anchored in Phoenix. The problem that these two regions have always faced is population and infrastructure. They're very arid regions that didn't support pre-industrial populations. So what people live there are, for the most part, limited to dense urban footprints. Now, those population centers are small enough and separated enough to limit possible economies of scale. That changes the sort of economic development they do and the sort of investment they attract. On the one hand, there's services and research, like the Denver Technology Center, or there's large combined process investment, like the semiconductor fab facilities that I discussed. There's 2 of them now that are being built in Phoenix. But if you add in general livability and low costs and low expansion costs, both of these zones are going to see population explosions, which will steadily improve the economics of any other industry that decides to put down roots here. Now, traditional manufacturing integration between these regions and Mexico is possible, but it will look considerably different than Mexico's businesses with Texas. The proximity of Mexican and Texas population centers makes it possible for various stages of the production process to cross the border multiple times. That's the whole basis of the automotive sector. You can't do that with Denver or Phoenix. It's just too far from the major Mexican cities. So the trick will be to find industries with more of a hub and spoke model. It's feasible, very feasible. Denver is one of the country's 3 biggest technology centers, and Phoenix will soon have 2 semiconductor fabrication centers. So when you're talking computer and electronics, when the intermittent pieces aren't trucked or railed, but flown, it's a perfect fit. Finally, Americans are on the move in a way that is going to hugely benefit the northern Mexican states. Now, this isn't so much a population density map as it is a map that highlights which urban centers in the United States can expand in what ways. So if the city is in red, it's come up against physical barriers and it can't go past, so it can only go up if it wants to expand. Whereas if you're in green, you're on the other extreme and there's absolutely nothing standing in the way of expanding in all points of the compass. Now, the point of this map is to highlight likely population evolutions within America. A few things are going on here. First, the average age of first-time home purchases is 32. The average millennial is 31. Millennials have discovered that they cannot raise kids in the dense coastal metro regions and are moving elsewhere. Second, the baby boomers, another huge demographic, are starting to retire, and they've discovered that they don't want to shovel snow, and so they're moving south. Third, because of coronavirus, no one wants to live where they're dependent upon mass transit systems. The cities on this map that are mass transit dependent are circled. And fourth, not all cities are created equal. Geography prevents some from expanding. That's what this map is all about. And where cities cannot sprawl, property prices will rise until they're out of reach for many. What this means is we're seeing housing demand in the cities of the South and the West and the Southwest rise, places where the cities can sprawl and which don't have meaningful transit. And coincidentally, most of those cities are in the green or the blue, where development costs would have been lower anyway. The point of all this is that the American demographic, and especially the American economic center, is moving south and west, closer to Mexico. And these are the parts of America which already have the largest exposure to Mexican culture. So Americans will integrate with Mexico more tightly in the future, simply because of proximity. And Mexico will be the only country in the world where that happens. So, as I said at the beginning, you are condemned to success. I'm sure you'll find a way to deal with it. Okay. If you need a little bit of light reading, here are the books. And at www.zeihan.com, you can sign up for my news and video letters. Totally free. Will always be free. I promise not to spam you with ads as well. Okay. That's it from me. And I will take whatever questions you guys have.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to turn it over. I know the governor already connected. I'm going to turn over for him to give a message. And then we'll proceed with the questions and answers. Adelante, gobernador, bienvenido. Ahorita esta conferencia es la celebración de los 2 años al frente de Desarrollo Económico. Como le he comentado, Desarrollo Económico aquí en alianza con Miguel Guerrero de Desarrollo Económico de Chihuahua, siempre hemos sido muy proactivos y trabajando por la región, buscando incrementar la calidad de vida del estado de Chihuahua. Y pues, como usted sabe, hemos estado muy proactivos organizando este tipo de eventos y conferencias. Aquí Peter siempre ha sido muy pragmático y siempre tiene muy bien mapeadas las zonas estratégicas del país y de Estados Unidos con quien más comercializamos. Entonces, le cedaría la palabra a usted para que nos dé un mensaje. Sé que venía un poquito rezagado y aquí estamos a sus órdenes. Adelante, gobernador.
A ver si... ¿Ahí me escuchó?
Sí.
Bueno, en primer lugar, muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Me da mucho gusto saludarlos. Como siempre, quiero agradecerle a Álvaro la convocatoria que siempre me ha hecho para acompañarles en las asambleas de desarrollo económico de Ciudad Juárez. Ahora, desafortunadamente, no podemos hacerlo de manera presencial, dadas las circunstancias, pero por esta vía de transmisión digital, pues nos brinda la posibilidad de seguir en contacto. Estoy seguro que todas las reflexiones que ustedes están realizando, que se hagan este día, esta misma conferencia, pues van a ser muy importantes para superar los retos que el contexto actual nos depara. Como ustedes saben, Chihuahua se encuentra en un momento que nos demanda una mayor colaboración entre todos los sectores de la sociedad. No solo hemos tenido que lidiar con una contingencia sanitaria provocada por esta pandemia del coronavirus, la crisis económica derivada de ella por la contracción de la economía, sino que ahora estamos enfrentando un asedio constante por parte del gobierno federal, en lo que nosotros hemos expresado con toda claridad, sin ambajes, nuestra preocupación por el momento actual que vive México, un proceso lamentable de restauración de carácter autoritario, en una dinámica de reinstalación de un viejo modelo presidencialista en México, de control político, de reconcentración de funciones, de facultades y de recursos. El recorte que se plantea para todas las entidades federativas en el 2021 en el presupuesto de egresos de la Federación lo confirma. Hay un desdén, diría yo, un desprecio por el desarrollo regional, por las demandas de las entidades federativas. Solo están visualizadas en justa dimensión o en su cabal dimensión, no sé si realmente sea justa, los proyectos y las prioridades del presidente de la República, tanto en programas sociales como en obras de infraestructura. Viene una enorme afectación a las entidades federativas de aprobarse este presupuesto en sus términos, sin hablar de lo que constituye el agandalle de los fondos federales en más de 109 fideicomisos, así como la noticia con la que nos acabamos de amanecer este día, la desaparición del Fondo Federal de Salud para enfrentar gastos catastróficos. Todo ello nos está colocando en un escenario muy complejo, muy complicado, pero precisamente un escenario que nos demanda a todos mucha sensibilidad mucha empatía, mucha unidad para enfrentar como sociedad este momento, que además tiene la enorme complicación en el momento actual que vive Chihuahua de habernos retornado al semáforo rojo que nos obliga a mantener las medidas sanitarias para salvaguardar la vida y la salud de todas y de todos los chihuahuenses. Es un momento muy complejo, muy difícil, el que nos ha tocado enfrentar, pero yo creo que son estos momentos los que nos definen como individuos, como sociedad, como líderes de nuestra comunidad, tanto en lo político como en el ámbito empresarial, porque las circunstancias nos demandan afrontar los obstáculos con altura de miras, con unidad, con solidaridad, pero también con valor. Estoy convencido que en la conjunción de pueblo y gobierno de Chihuahua hay esta cualidad y esta característica. De eso dimos una demostración el pasado lunes, cuando desde el Palacio Estatal de Gobierno lanzamos un reclamo de exigencia de justicia presupuestal, de equidad fiscal para Chihuahua, y lo hicimos en un acto plural, muy representativo de sectores y liderazgos sociales, políticos y empresariales, académicos de nuestra entidad. Me gustaría poderles compartir lo que estamos haciendo en dos grandes rubros, pues en estas dos grandes crisis que enfrentamos, la sanitaria y la económica, pero obviamente también en lo que yo llamo la tercera o cuarta crisis que enfrentamos, además de la de seguridad, que es la política. Ahí se está construyendo en México, a partir de la Alianza Federalista, un movimiento reformador en materia de carácter fiscal, en materia fiscal. Es un movimiento muy poderoso que se constituye como un equilibrio y contrapeso a este fenómeno de regresión autoritaria que está viviendo el país. Y es muy esperanzador porque nunca, desde el régimen constitucional mexicano o desde el federalismo planteado en la Constitución del 17, nunca se había planteado un contrapeso desde los gobiernos de los estados y desde la acción de los gobernadores en torno del centralismo que ha padecido México. En el ámbito sanitario, como ustedes lo saben, desde que nosotros tuvimos las primeras noticias acerca de la enfermedad provocada por el SARS-CoV-2, decidimos desde el gobierno del estado tomar las medidas, las acciones para fortalecer nuestro sistema estatal de salud. Cuando el virus llegó a nuestro país y se puso en marcha la Jornada Nacional de Sana Distancia, supimos que sería necesario ejecutar ciertas acciones con el fin de proteger a nuestras familias y a nuestras empresas. Por esa razón, precisamente, lanzamos el Plan Emergente de Apoyo y Protección a la Salud, el Empleo y el Ingreso Familiar, un plan que fue y sigue siendo, en el contexto del país, el que más recursos ha destinado para la atención integral a la población. Estoy hablando de un presupuesto, el de Chihuahua, el que ejercemos este año, alrededor de 76,000, 77,000 millones de pesos, que puede ser la mitad, por ejemplo, del de la Ciudad de México, una tercera parte del de la Ciudad de México, que es la mitad del presupuesto de Jalisco, y sin embargo es el plan que más recursos reorientó. Estamos convencidos de que si no lo hubiéramos hecho, ahora estaríamos enfrentando problemas mayúsculos, no solo en materia económica y sanitaria, sino en temas de carácter social, particularmente de la inseguridad pública. Por eso, para el gobierno del estado fue fundamental que las micro, pequeñas y medianas empresas contaran con ciertos apoyos con el fin de paliar en algo los efectos negativos provocados por la pandemia. Y de esta manera decidimos apostar a las empresas. Se trata de la columna vertebral de nuestra economía y es el sector indispensable para la reactivación económica. Lamentablemente esta visión no se entendió en el país, nunca se comprendió y nunca se reaccionó como lo requeríamos. Y hemos sido fundamentalmente las entidades federativas quienes hemos respondido ante este desafío. Y es más, es muy importante decirlo, en un foro como el de desarrollo económico, gracias a los esfuerzos combinados del empresariado y del gobierno del estado, Chihuahua logró atraer inversiones en plena pandemia y ha liderado la recuperación de empleos en el país en los últimos 4 meses, de acuerdo a las cifras presentadas por el Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social en lo que se refiere a plazas laborales formales. El que se hayan concretado esfuerzos que a lo largo de los últimos años ha tenido la Secretaría de Innovación y Desarrollo Económico y que se hayan concretado en plena pandemia, pocos días después a la entrada del TEMEC, habla del nivel de confianza que se tiene en Chihuahua en su empresariado y por supuesto de la certidumbre jurídica que siente la inversión extranjera en este estado. Y creo que es muy importante destacarlo como parte de una estrategia que ha liderado la Secretaría de Innovación y Desarrollo Económico, cuya titular es una empresaria forjada también en desarrollo económico de Ciudad Juárez y en otros organismos empresariales, la ingeniera Alejandra de la Vega, una estrategia para impulsar la economía. Y hemos seguido trabajando de la mano con organismos como este y otros para la coordinación y promoción de iniciativas de desarrollo económico. Por ejemplo, el caso del Frente Norte, la estrategia que consiste precisamente en poner en marcha proyectos estratégicos para fortalecer la innovación y maximizar el desarrollo de nuevas tecnologías, lo que va a redundar en una mayor competitividad para Juárez. Están en Juárez 2 de nuestras principales apuestas de desarrollo tecnológico y de innovación. El CIA, que se le ha denominado IA Center, que es el Centro de Inteligencia Artificial, y el CITA, que es este proyecto que ha impulsado desarrollo económico de Ciudad Juárez durante mucho tiempo y que se ha concretado en nuestra administración de la mano del Instituto Politécnico Nacional. Además, estamos participando en el diseño y gestión de proyectos como Chihuahua Exponencial, como el Puente Acelerador de Empresas, que ambos tienen la finalidad de potenciar una economía local e involucrar a los proveedores locales en las cadenas de suministro globales. Y también mediante el área de gestión estratégica de la Secretaría de Innovación y Desarrollo Económico, se atiende al sector empresarial para informar acerca de las actividades que el gobierno del estado está implementando para reactivar, para reanimar la economía. Una de ellas es la iniciativa Chihuahua ¿Qué te falta?, que tiene por objeto localizar proveedores regionales para atender necesidades específicas de los diferentes sectores de la industria. Como saben, y tal como hemos querido dejarlo patente, para nuestro gobierno es de gran trascendencia reactivar la economía e impulsar el desarrollo económico de nuestra entidad, establecer alianzas estratégicas destinadas a impulsar y así garantizar el bienestar de la población. Lo he dicho en innumerables ocasiones, nuestro gobierno sí cree en la alianza con los empresarios. Nosotros creemos ideológica y doctrinalmente, no solo a través de la política pública, que la iniciativa privada es la más viva fuente del mejoramiento social. Y es una de las mejores maneras de generar un desarrollo social con igualdad e inclusión. la mejor política de desarrollo social, hemos dicho, es la generación y la creación de empleos. Y sé que en este objetivo contaremos con ustedes, como lo hemos visto en estos tiempos aciagos, y con un liderazgo tan nítido, tan claro, tan pujante, como es el de Álvaro Bustillos, de quien no solamente tengo la fortuna de compartir ahora una amistad personal, sino haber llevado una relación institucional muy importante en estos 2 años que ha estado al frente de desarrollo económico. Y bueno, no por algo, ustedes mismos le han pedido a Álvaro continuar con una serie de proyectos, concretar metas y propósitos que nos planteó cuando llegó a este organismo tan importante para nosotros. En los últimos meses, las y los empresarios del Estado han sacado la casta. No solo nos han ayudado cuando ha habido la necesidad de tener que parar la actividad, les agradezco mucho esa comprensión. No son decisiones fáciles para un gobierno como el nuestro, pero también cuando ha habido que impulsar las medidas sanitarias pertinentes, han sido muy solidarios y han contribuido con donaciones en especie al combate de esta pandemia. No se me puede olvidar nunca la iniciativa que Desarrollo Económico de Juárez y Desarrollo Económico de Chihuahua empujaron en el conjunto del empresariado, y cómo fueron de los primeros que, incluso con aportaciones personales, Álvaro en Juárez, Miguel en Chihuahua, iniciaron una dinámica de donaciones para el combate a esta pandemia, y por ello de corazón les agradezco ese ejemplo de generosidad y de entrega. Como ustedes saben, desgraciadamente actualmente enfrentamos un repunte de contagios, y peor aún, se nos ha elevado el indicador que más nos preocupa, que es el de defunciones por COVID, que nos han obligado a volver a la luz roja en este semáforo de riesgo epidemiológico, con el que vamos ahora sí que evaluando la reactivación económica o el reinicio de actividades o la ampliación de aforos, de horarios, de actividades. Es muy complicado, a veces sé que no se entienden estas decisiones, pero no teníamos de otra, porque superar las capacidades del sistema de salud nos puede colapsar en muchos sentidos. Hemos planteado esta medida para un periodo de no más de 18 días. Ojalá que podamos cumplir entre todos este propósito, esta meta, que tiene como objetivo preciso bajar la carga activa, el número de casos positivos en plena faceta de transmisión o potencialidad de transmisión. Y por eso quiero pedirles aprovechar esta oportunidad que me brindan de participar en su asamblea para pedirles una vez más su apoyo y su comprensión. Vivimos tiempos, insisto, muy complicados que demandan de la cooperación y el esfuerzo de todas y de todos, de respetar las disposiciones sanitarias conducentes que son promovidas por nuestro Consejo Estatal de Salud. En Chihuahua sí funciona el Consejo Estatal de Salud, no estamos tomando las decisiones al capricho o por la voluntad de unos cuantos. Hemos discutido en el seno del Consejo Estatal de Salud. En la última sesión ampliamos la participación a los sectores económicos de nuestra entidad. Estuvieron nuestros principales líderes empresariales en el Estado, de manera que si nosotros cumplimos con estas medidas, podamos continuar pronto con nuestro esfuerzo de reactivación económica al finalizar el periodo que nos hemos dado. Pues les pido que en esta parte, en la del riesgo sanitario, nos ayuden a ser voceros de la salud, a ser promotores de la responsabilidad social. He dicho que el virus no le está ganando la batalla al personal de salud o a las capacidades instaladas del sistema estatal de salud. El virus está ganando a la irresponsabilidad social, a la inconsciencia, a la falta de solidaridad, de disciplina, de compromiso. El virus conoce la época de individualismo atroz que estamos viviendo y sabe aprovecharse de la indolencia social para guardar las medidas de sana distancia. Pero si ustedes nos ayudan y si logramos que los indicadores COVID disminuyan, entonces el semáforo va a poder cambiar de color y podremos continuar por la senda positiva que habíamos logrado hace unas semanas. Es que Chihuahua fue en un periodo pues récord, a diferencia de otros estados del país, al semáforo amarillo. El problema es que la gente entró al amarillo y se sintió en verde. Y volvieron las fiestas, y volvieron las reuniones, y la presencia en la calle, y la concentración, etc. En fin, pues un poco les traslado mis preocupaciones actuales, pero también mi ánimo y mi confianza, mi esperanza de que vamos a salir adelante en esta unidad estratégica que tenemos con los líderes empresariales de Chihuahua. Los invito a que sigamos colaborando juntos, que fortalezcamos los lazos que hemos construido a lo largo de esta administración. Aún tenemos desafíos comunes que enfrentar y solo podremos hacerlo cerrando filas como lo hicimos el lunes pasado, en una actitud de unidad con valor, sin complejos, sin tenerle miedo al linchamiento mediático o a esta narrativa polarizadora que se ha enquistado en la más alta tribuna del país. Yo les reitero que el gobierno del estado seguirá trabajando arduamente para que, sin dejar de cuidar la salud y la vida de las y los chihuahuenses, le demos también nuevos bríos a la economía de nuestro estado. No quiero dejar pasar la oportunidad de agradecerles una vez más también el respaldo que han dado tanto al gobierno del estado como a los agricultores de Chihuahua ante un tema tan delicado como el conflicto del agua, y ese apoyo para nosotros ha sido también sustancial. Pues sin más, les mando un saludo, un abrazo y otra vez mi solicitud para que juntos concienticemos a la población del momento que vivimos y de las acciones diversas que tenemos que emprender para que nuestro futuro siga teniendo porvenir. Muchas gracias, Álvaro, y muchas gracias a todas y a todos por darme esta oportunidad.
Gracias, gobernador. Pues le recibimos aquí su mensaje y a todos, gracias por estar atentos y ser solidarios en esos aspectos y en esas iniciativas respecto a la concientización de la salud. Le agradecemos mucho la presencia, gobernador, y aquí el apoyo solidario de los empresarios que siempre hemos trabajado coordinadamente por el bien de nuestro estado y de nuestras ciudades y nuestra región. Gracias de nuevo, gobernador, y estamos a sus órdenes.
Hasta luego, gracias, Álvaro.
Yo creo que seguimos sin más, me gustaría ver que participen bastantes de ustedes aquí con Peter, de nuevo a retomar algunas de las preguntas de su excelente presentación y de muchos de los datos que nos puso en ella, que lo sentimos de una manera muy positiva respecto a México. Entonces, pues, sin más, les pediría que levanten la mano y les cedo la palabra para que sea directo. Peter, thank you. We'll go back to questions and answers.
Thank you, Peter. Álvaro, si te pareces, hay una pregunta aquí en orden digamos, de aparición de Paul Foster con el tema farmacéutico.
Paul, you want to take the mic and ask your question to Peter? Ahí lo veo conectado, Paul.
Yeah. I'm curious in your segment, all your 6 segments, why pharmaceuticals didn't come up, and I'm curious to know your opinion as to what's going to happen with pharmaceuticals and medical device, particularly with respect to companies pulling out of China?
Sure. The reason I picked the 6 that I did is those are the factors that those are the subsectors that I expect to move most quickly. The capital structure, the consumption structure, the financial structure all advocates for those to relocate within a year or two for the most part. With pharmaceuticals, it's a little bit more complicated. It's not that we don't know how to build the infrastructure to do it, but doing it from scratch is a 6 to an 18-month process. Mexico doesn't have the labor force for it, and the United States does not have the regulatory certainty for it. For pharmaceuticals to move, one of 2 things has to happen. Number one, you need an act of Congress that simply mandates that a certain percentage of these materials are produced and the finished drugs produced in the United States. Without that, people are going to go to the low-cost producer. That's still India, that's still China. Second, you could have an interruption in the flow. The Chinese, for whatever reason, accidentally, because of coronavirus, for political reasons, for strategic reasons, could actively reduce the flows to the United States, which, let's make it very clear, will kill several thousand people. If that were to happen, obviously this would go into overdrive almost overnight. But the Chinese, for whatever reason, have chosen not to do that, and Congress has proven incapable of acting on the other half. So we're still in flux as to where this stuff is ultimately going to come from. So I think it will happen, but it's not like just making another incremental part for a fax machine. This requires a lot more buildup of the industrial plant first.
Thank you, Peter. The next question comes from Francisco Gonzalez de Cosillo. Francisco is a friend of mine that from Harvard. Adelante, Francisco.
Álvaro, gracias por organizar esto. No sé si sigue el gobernador en línea, pero solo para decirle que le deseo mucha suerte en su reto al gobierno federal. De lo que hemos visto en medios, creo que es muy atinado lo que está haciendo y es uno de los muchos errores de este gobierno. Peter, thank you for your very insightful and interesting presentation. Ever since we met you here in Harvard, I bought your 3 books and I've been reading them, and I subscribe to your newsletter. I look forward to seeing it.
I apologize to everyone you know.
And I have 2 small questions, if it's not an abuse. The first one has to do with I was very interested in the trends that you identified that favor Mexico. And one question that popped in my mind is that dealing or reaping those benefits will require capital. And the government policies we've recently seen in our federal government are such that we are running investors away. So I query whether the cost of attracting capital will suffer because of this, and what insights you see about that.
Yeah, I have no argument with that point. Obviously, AMLO's policies are not great for development, whether it's at the local or the state level. Something that you might want to think about is Mexico really doesn't have a capital market. It might be time to, at a minimum, get into state and municipal bonds. The capital is there globally. People are desperate to find new investment methods in order to put it away for the next 2 years. Because that is the period where we have this ultra loose monetary policy. That's the period where a lot of the advanced world is moving into mass retirement, is trying to look at that extra bit of return before they retire. So now is absolutely the time to take out whatever debt you plan on. And because Mexico has really usually just had these isolated urban centers separated by vast swaths of less than useful territory, you guys, your banking system, your financial system is local. It's not national. You really don't have a banking network in the way that the United States or the Western Europeans have. And I don't think you're going to fix that in a couple of years. But by tapping the bond market, you can probably get a lot of capital in a way. This is going to sound like a weird comparison, but like the Argentines keep doing. It's like, no matter how bad things are in Mexico, it is better run than Buenos Aires. And if they can get people to invest, you guys certainly can.
Adelante. Thank you, Peter. Luis Alberto Barrio.
No, Álvaro, no tenía pregunta yo. A lo mejor se levantó la mano, pero no. Gracias.
José Montes.
Sí, buenas tardes, gracias por una excelente presentación. Mi pregunta es, is it okay to do it in Spanish or English? What do you prefer?
English, Pepe, English.
English, okay. My
La
question is
otra.
about the
Sorry.
electric vehicle industry, and the Arizona Sun Corridor has already seen some facilities started to pop there in this type of industry. Do you see an opportunity for the electric vehicle industry either in the Arizona Sun Corridor or some other of the industrial areas that you pointed out today?
Yeah, I see no reason why EVs can't follow the same approximate path for internal combustion engines. Yes, they have far fewer moving parts. So it's not like we're going to have this broad constellation of tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers like we're used to with normal automotive. It will be a tighter group, but it'll be a little bit higher value added. And honestly, from a manufacturing part, the part that is up for grabs will be simpler. So I don't think it's going to take too much industrial expansion or expanding the industrial footprint all that much in order to get a bite of it. Every automaker in the country is starting to run EV lines. And so you can work through kind of your existing contact network in order to get a piece of that if that's something you're after. The one exception, of course, is Tesla, which is infamous for wanting to keep all development in-house and not farm out any of their production anywhere else. But don't worry, Tesla is not going to be a significant player in the EV market much longer. They've already maxed out what they can get from subsidies, and they've already maxed out the high-end luxury vehicle market, and they're just not competitive in the middle market. That's going to be the part of Ford and Toyota and all the rest, and all of those open for business.
Sergio Bustamante is next. Adelante, Sergio.
Peter, thank you for a great presentation. My question is, with this letter that we saw that the senator sent to President Trump in relation to the energy investment that the Canadian and the United States companies have done in Mexico, what are your thoughts in relation to what's going to happen with the Mexican government?
I don't think I need to underline for you guys that energy investment from the outside world into Mexico is difficult. I mean, you have the most restrictive energy market in the world. North Korea is easier to invest in right now than Mexico. And I don't think that's going to change under this administration. Now, the pipelines are in place for natural gas transit. You guys have the capacity in terms of import capacity to take like 3, almost 4 times as much as you're currently taking. The holdup is on building the facilities, whether for chemical manufacture or for power generation on the Mexican side of the border. And yes, foreign investors would like a piece of that, but you have to have a government that's going to allow it. So at present, this is going to be really depressing, but at present it's up to Pemex, which is arguably the worst company in the world. And until you guys find a way to fix that or hive off at the state or local level for power generation away from Pemex, I don't see that specific issue getting much better. Of all the things that AMLO has done that are questionable, it's his fascination with Pemex that I think is the biggest problem and causing the most long-term damage at present.
Thank you.
I think Francisco had another question. He didn't answer he didn't ask the second question. Adelante, Francisco, again.
Gracias, Álvaro. Como ya pregunté, puedo estar al final de la fila, a menos que no haya más preguntas.
Les pediría a todos que levanten la manita si tienen una pregunta. Aprovechen que aquí está Peter. La verdad que tenerlo aquí es muy importante para que hagan sus preguntas. Es difícil tener a Peter aquí.
Eugenio es Álvaro. Adelante, Eugenio.
Hello, Peter. Good to hear you again. About these issues that the Mexican government is kind of blocking what's happening with the energy sector, as well as with the INMEX export enterprises, with this kind of changing in the game of the way the structure for importing inbound and then exporting, as well as in other matters that seem to break the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement in some areas. Do you think that the United States would set in the right direction what the TEMEC or the U.S. agreement, the U.S.-Mexico Canada agreement, states and make good what's written in there?
I wouldn't count on the federal administration, regardless of who runs the election, to change their policies or honestly to notice. The Trump administration, from his point of view, he's gotten what he wants out of Mexico City, and relations are great, and there's no reason to poke the bear. If Biden comes in, his model is more for economic nationalization and, I'm sorry, not nationalization, economic nationalism. Just keeping as much of it within American borders as possible, whether it's for government contracting or supply chains. So anything that Mexico does to hurt its own case is not something that the Biden administration is going to have a problem with. The way to challenge that is through your American partners in the private sector and get them to lobby the American government on your behalf. That is by far the best way to challenge items like what AMLO is doing right now. I don't want to give you false hope. It's not a quick process because you first have to convince the American partners what's wrong, and then you have to get them to bring suit and petition the American government to bring suit. That is not something that's going to get resolved within 12 months, but that is your best bet right now.
Thank you, Peter.
Peter, do you think, so you're predicting Biden's going to win?
That's where the numbers are pointing right now. I know that the polls last time around predicted a Hillary Clinton win, and then she lost, but the gap is about triple now what it was then. And I mean, Texas is a swing state, and Biden only needs one swing state.
Okay. Well, how do you see the relationship with AMLO now that you said AMLO had a perfect relationship with Trump, and even when President AMLO went all the way to Washington, he didn't even get together with the Democrats. Do you see a rocky road for us?
If Biden wins, yes. Now, remember, when AMLO won and it was AMLO and Trump, I was like, oh my God, two narcissists, this is going to be a disaster. It worked out great. It's like they're, when they look across the border, they think it's like looking in a mirror. They love each other. And, thank God. Biden, once you get past the aw shucks attitude, he's an economic nationalist. And so trade relations are probably going to be a bit of a problem. Now, I don't think he's going to challenge NAFTA 2. It was ratified. The Democrats were broadly on board with it, even though everybody decided at the time that they hated Trump. Remember, NAFTA 2 was ratified by Congress the same day that the impeachment proceedings began. So it's like there's not a problem here with the broad-scale American-Mexican relationship. But Biden's team wants to keep as much American value add within America as possible. And while Mexico is not going to be anywhere near the top of the list of the countries to go after, it's going to be a long list. And the personalities of Biden versus AMLO are probably going to be a lot more traditional. I mean, we're used to Mexico City and Washington sniping at one another. That will probably pick up again. But keep in mind, we've had 4 presidents under the first NAFTA, and we lived through it.
Thank you, Peter. I see Renato Martinez, then Carlos Murguia.
Hey, Peter. Thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. And following up on Alvaro's question, I don't know to what extent, I mean, there has been a lot of focus on the potential retaliation from a political standpoint that Biden administration may have against AMLO and his government because of its proximity or perceived cordiality with Trump's administration. But beyond that, I wonder if I don't know, the commitments, challenges, alliances that Biden has developed in order to get the support, let's say, of the Midwest states, of the labor force, and his nationalistic view of economy may impact as a matter of policy, not of personal relationship or of diplomacy even, but as a matter of strategy, its trade policy, and particularly its trade policy with Mexico. Do you see that being relevant during his term?
I think you've kind of put the finger on it. Trump's relationships with everybody are personal. And if you happen to be on his good side, as AMLO is, things go great. And if you happen to be on his bad side, look out. With Biden, it would be a much more professional relationship. And so it's not that Biden is anti-Mexico. He's not. He's anti-everyone, if that makes more sense. And honestly, there's an opportunity for Mexico in that too, if the relations are handled well. I don't think that AMLO and Biden are personally going to get along. But I'm shocked that AMLO and Trump personally got along. So, I could be wrong on this. I'm just suggesting that in a Biden administration, the United States is going to be much more isolationist in economic affairs within the context of NAFTA.
Right. Thank you, Peter. Adelante, Carlos.
Dale, Charlie.
Sí, adelante. Gracias, Alvaro. Nice presentation, Peter, like always. There's a saying in Mexico, and I think I needed to ask you this. We always say, no, the United States is not going to let Mexico become socialist. Don't worry about that. They're going to do something about it. And we're going that way so fast. I mean, this guy, I don't have.
He's not your favorite. I get it.
Oh, yeah. So he already controls two, and maybe all of the three powers of any country, like the executive, both houses of Congress, and I'm sure he's also getting to control, if not already, the judicial power. So what do you think about that? When is the United going to react, or they maybe will never react if we become a socialist country? What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, let's define socialism. What's going on in Venezuela? That's not socialism. That's kleptocracy. That's civil collapse. There's no one in the United States is worried about that happening in Mexico. I mean, don't get me wrong. You have your challenges, you have your problems, you have your shortcomings, but it's not even within an order of magnitude of that. As to the core of your question, when will the U.S. step in? The hard answer is never. The United States has no interest in interfering in political or security matters. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. In political matters south of the border. The cartel threat is about the only thing that might draw us in at present. And the last 3 administrations of Mexico have been broadly cooperative with the United States when it sees something it considers a problem. There's obviously a boatload of caveats within that statement, but the security authorities and the intelligence authorities in the United States are broadly happy with the relationship. And AMLO is not standing in the way of that cooperation. So while there are many north of the border who look at AMLO and his security policies and his trade policies are like, not thrilled with that. There's no intervention option for the United States, even if in the aftermath of Afghanistan and Iraq, we were like gung-ho and thought it was a good idea, and we don't. So I don't think you need to worry about that specifically. To the unasked question, I mean, this is going to sound a little professory, but the solution is civil society. One of the big problems that Mexico has had is you get these industrial and economic entrepot cities in all your major population centers where the local political authority is the local economic authority. It's very oligarchy, and that strongly encourages your common people to turn populist. And that's what you're dealing with right now. Until you have a more diversified civil society that has its own interests, it's very easy for a demagogue to come in and scoop everything up. And I don't mean to suggest that you can fix that in a year. Hell, in the United States, we fall for it. But it is part of the democratic process and making sure people have stakes in the system.
Thank you, Peter. Luis Fernandez, adelante.
Peter, how do you see the immigration policy with Biden?
Biden will do the same thing that Trump did with NAFTA. He'll do some minor modifications, slap a new name on it. Right now, under AMLO, Mexico is the wall. Unofficially, Americans are no longer worried about Mexican immigration because it's been negative for 10 years. Even the Trump administration will quietly admit that. It's Central American immigration that we're worried about. And so in encouraging AMLO to take a stronger stance against transmigration, the Americans have gotten everything that they want on the topic. And Biden recognizes that, and Biden's fine with that. He just might tweak the policy a little bit.
Thank you, Peter. Jesus Mesta, if not, I'll read it for you. I know you're trying to ask a question. I'll ask it for him. How do you foresee the commercial airlines, American Airlines, Delta, Southwest in the USA and others around the world?
Yeah, that's kind of ugly. Roughly half of all travel is tourism. And pre-COVID, about 20% of the travelers were business travelers, and they generated 80% of the income. Those two lines are gutted right now. Business travelers are discovering you can do things like this. And so it's unlikely that business travel is going to come back within a decade. And for tourism, not only aren't there not a lot of places where you can go without having to quarantine, but about half of all tourism dollars are from retirees. Retirees are facing a health threat. And because if you're a younger baby boomer and you're approaching retirement, you've got to save everything you can for retirement in an environment where your job isn't secure. So tourism is unlikely to get back to where it was in the United States until 2024 or 2025, much less global tourism, which in an era of disorder is never coming back. It's an ugly picture for the airlines, which means that right now we probably have something like 2/3 over capacity with global passenger seats. There are a huge number of airlines that are not going to survive this, and the ones that do are basically going to be de facto nationalized. We're going to have another airline bailout in the United States. Whether it'll be part of this next negotiation or not, or happen next year, I don't know. But it's going to be a lot like what happened with the automakers after 2007 to 2009, but without any hope of an imminent rebound in stock values or passenger numbers or sales. So anyone who's in the aerospace environment has to prepare for that. Now, I'm not sure this is the right word, but on the upside, there is no way that Airbus survives this. There is no way that Etihad or Emirates survive this. So we're going to be going into a world with a lot less demand and a lot less supply for airlines.
Francisco, go ahead.
Una última pregunta para ir concluyendo la reunión.
Sí. Francisco, si quieres, finaliza con tu pregunta y en eso ya cerraríamos ya la conferencia. Federico Talavera tiene una. Adelante, Federico, y luego Francisco y ya.
¿Quién, yo?
Adelante.
Hi, Peter. Quick question. We just created the Chihuahua State Investment Attraction Agency. So what are your top 3 countries, of course the US, but besides the US, and top 3 sectors we should go after?
When you say go after, you mean like as investment sources and
Yes.
export sources?
No, investment.
Okay. As in sources or destinations?
As countries we should promote the state of Chihuahua for investment.
Okay, you want them to invest in you. Okay. The Japanese and Koreans are all over the map right now. They realize that they're facing a terminal demographic situation at home, and they're not going to be able to keep their production costs under control. The Japanese are much further out in terms of finding new sources to develop and build stuff in, and they prefer to have it in consumption-led economy. So Mexico, check, check, check. besides those two, the Germans need a completely different economic model. And while they would prefer to be in Europe, they are coming to the belated conclusion that the Americans really are out of the picture. And if they're going to have access, they have to do the same thing that the Japanese are doing. Obviously, the Germans have significant facilities in both Mexico and Texas right now. There's no reason to not expect more. And then third, if you can stomach it, if you have good IT firewalls, China's in meltdown, and they are looking to do something similar. Now, that's not the Chinese state, and that is not Chinese state businesses, but Chinese business people are starting to do what Thai business people did in 1996, and they're fleeing the ship. And they've got technology, and they are not cost sensitive, and they are willing to build anywhere in order to move their supply chains into more secure countries. In terms of sectors, I gave you those top 6. I think those are all worth going after. But for Chihuahua specifically, I would be looking at tech very big, especially a partnership with Arizona when it comes to semiconductor manufacture. Because if you can get a foot into that world, everything that's electronics then opens to you. And that's something that Mexico has the cost structure to just hit the ground running.
Thank you, Peter. Una última pregunta ya para cerrar la conferencia. Francisco González otra vez. Dale.
Peter, a more conceptual question, perhaps a little bit philosophical, which is that I'm interested in what's happening in different parts of the world regarding capitalism. People holding it responsible for many evils that we see all over the place. And for instance, what's happening in Chile right now. Do you sense, or what is your take on that phenomenon? Is it really a redefinition of capitalism, a redefinition of the social pact of all stakeholders involved?
Let me first give you the positive side, specifically with Chile, so you don't have to worry about it. You know, Pinochet was brilliant. He listened to the technocrats. In terms of economic development, he did the right thing. But wow, he was an asshole. And Chile has been recovering culturally from that ever since. And so the idea that the people of Chile want a new start and want to find a way to balance cultural strength and economic strength, perfectly reasonable. And this is the process you go through to do that. So I don't think this is a rejection of capitalism. I think this is a rejection of statism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how that plays out over the next 2 years, we'll see. You can, like I said, constitutional reform does not always end well. To your core question, yeah, capitalism is done. Capitalism is based upon the concept of more. More populations, greater markets, more investment, more technological advancement, more integration, more manufacturing, more. But so is socialism. So is corporatism and Nazism and fascism. Every economic theory that we have had for the last 200 years is based on more. And we don't have more anymore. The population of the world is now in decline. It's happening in every single advanced country and every single developing country. There's still some undeveloped countries that are still experiencing population rise, but honestly, they're not in the top 150 top list of 150 economies. This decade, we were going to flip from a world of more to a world of less, regardless of what happened. Between the American withdrawal and coronavirus, it's going to happen faster. And we're going to have to figure out a fundamentally new economic model, and I have no idea what that is. What I can tell you is 2 things. Number one, the United States and Mexico are going to very soon be the 2 largest consumption-led economies in the world, which means that we have more time to figure this out, and we can watch everybody else struggle with it first. We can learn from their mistakes. We can learn from their victories. And since our trade is about, or our economies are about 85% with just the 2 of us, we have at least 20 years before this is mission critical. Second, what was the second? It's gone. It'll come back. I hope it comes back when I'm still on.
Okay. Thank you for that insight.
Thank you, Peter.
Oh, second. I got it.
Go ahead.
The last time we as a species argued over economic theories, we argued really vociferously. I mean, that's everything from the German unification wars to World War II to the Cold War. I do not expect this to be a pleasant process to watch. But for Mexico and America, we get to watch it. It doesn't happen here. It happens there. So again, every competitor that you have is fundamentally screwed. Take that for what it is.
Thank you.
Peter, as we saw today when we were preparing this, when we were talking about this presentation in the last few days, we were talking about Mexico, and you've been very positive on our country. Alvaro and myself, we challenged that assumption from you, but I guess we were not successful. So it's good to hear that comment from you. I thank you to you and Susan for all your time and patience working with us once again. So we hope to see you soon, Peter.
My pleasure.
Last, I wanna, before we close the conference, Peter, any last words you wanna add?
I just can't I cannot overstate how important the constitutional reformation process is for Mexico. Your constitution is old. It predates 2 regime changes. It is not appropriate for the environment that you're living in today. It needs to be revised. It needs to be overhauled. You need a new one, however you want to put it. Better that people who can do math are involved in the process. Do not leave this to be AMLO's next toy.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. With this, we'll finalize your conference. I want to first thank you very much for always being a part of Desarrollo Económico and business leadership and community here from El Paso, Ciudad Juárez, and Chihuahua. I know I want to thank all my friends that have joined us in the talk, Peter. And thank you again. You know, you have your home and a friend here in Ciudad Juárez. Gracias a todos mis amigos de Chihuahua, a todos los liderazgos empresariales del estado por haberse conectado. Quiero agradecerles también a todos mis amigos de México en Movimiento, de OPM de Harvard que se conectaron y de YPO. Gracias a todos los que estuvieron muy atentos y con esto pues damos finalizada la conferencia y la participación aquí, la intervención de Peter. Gracias.
Take care, everyone.
Gracias a todos. Muy buena tarde.
¡Bravo, Presi!
Gracias. ¡Felicidades, Álvaro!
Felicidades, Álvaro, felicidades.
¡Felicidades, Álvaro!
Ahora
Alvarito,
sí,
un abrazo,
ahora
felicidades.
Sí,
Felicidades, Álvaro.
Muchas felicidades, Álvaro. Ya pronto hacemos la comida.
No les quiero presumir las botellas que ya tienen preparadas atrás, ¿eh?
Alvarito, acá en Chihuahua, aquí lo esperamos, mi rey.
¿Dónde nos vamos a ver, Álvaro?
Tiene ticket para Santanita este vato.
¿De aquí para dónde,
Felicidades,
Álvaro?
Saludos.
Les agradezco a todos.
Buenas tardes, gracias por la invitación.
Gracias, muy buena tarde a todos.
Gracias. Nos vemos, Fer. Nos vemos, Álvaro. Felicidades. Excelente informe. Te salvaste poquito, Fer Talavera.
Hello.
Felicidades también.
Felicidades, Presi.
Bueno, ahí nos guardas una copita de vino, mi Álvaro.
Felicidades, mi Álvaro. Un abrazo.
Venido.
Gracias. Muy buen día.
Gracias a todos. Buenas tardes. Saludos. Con esto finalizamos.
Felicidades, Álvaro. Muchas felicidades.